Hello, this is Chris Cohen with another chess endgame lesson. Today we're going to look at queen versus pawn. And with queen versus pawn, black can only get a draw if his king can support his pawn on the 7th rank, where he can either queen his pawn or if he can get stalemate, which is a special case. So there's a winning method to show, but the first thing to note is that in any of these queen versus pawn endgames, if white can get his queen in front of the pawn, then he'll always win. Here with the queen in front of the pawn, occupying the queening square, black will never be able to promote his pawn, and white can just bring his king in and win the pawn. So black wants to keep his pawn, or white will capture it and get a win, and then white can just move his king in and cover the pawn. And basically here white will take the pawn on the next move. The general winning procedure is for white to use his queen to give check or pin the pawn, or just to gain time so that he can bring in his king. And white will use a kind of a stair-stepping method, moving his queen diagonally by 1 square each time. So first he gives check, and this forces black to either move his king in front of the pawn, which just makes things easier for white. We'll see that every time that black's king is forced in front of the pawn, white has time to bring his king in. White will bring his king in until it's on the pawn and he can win the pawn. So black doesn't want to get in front of the pawn right away. And now white stair steps or zigzags his queen forward, 1 diagonal square at a time. Black can't promote the pawn or white will take it. He needs to move his king to protect the pawn. And once again, white uses this zigzag pattern, and again. And now white's queen is close enough to the pawn to use this maneuver. First he gives check, then comes onto the pawn, and this is the key move or key position. White gives check, so black doesn't have time to queen the pawn, and he gives check and is on the pawn, so that if black moves his king away, then white will just take the pawn. Black's king is forced in front of the pawn, and now white has time to move his king forward, and then we'll repeat a pattern a few times, pinning the pawn to the side, giving check, and with this same pattern to reach this key position, where once again black has to move in front of the pawn and white's king has time to approach, and with the same pattern pinning the pawn to the side and then giving check, coming in like this, and once again getting to this key position. Black has to go in front of the pawn, white's king can approach, and with white's king in this zone, he can support check, where once again black has to go in front of the pawn, and now white's king moves in. Black has to go here, and now with king and queen on the pawn, white can take the pawn and then give mate. Now there is a special case where black can get a draw, and that's when white's king blocks the queen from giving check, where white's queen just can't give check or pin the pawn. So this is a really special case. As it happens, white's queen doesn't have any diagonal checks, any checks to the side, or any way of pinning the pawn. If white's king were not obstructing the e-file, then white could win as before. But here in this position, on black's next move, he'll queen the pawn. So you can see white does not have any moves that give check, doesn't have any way to pin the pawn. No matter where white goes, then black can get a draw. It's important to know these basic positions when you're in an endgame where there's a continuation that can go to a queen and pawn ending, it's good to know these exceptions to avoid getting a draw, to avoid misplacing your king. But the important thing to remember, there are really four important things to remember, and we've already looked at two. First, if white's queen can get in front of the pawn, then white wins. White can win by the stair-stepping procedure that we saw before. And the next couple of things we're going to look at, special cases where black has a rook pawn or bishop pawn and can get a draw. So here, white can't use that zigzag method because black has a special stalemate resource. So if white tries this idea that we'd seen before, black can just go into the corner. And now white doesn't have time or can't take the pawn because this position is stalemate with a draw. And he can't move in his king for the same reason. Black would just queen the pawn, and even if it weren't check, black just queens the pawn, and white doesn't have any special cases where he can give mate, even though black queens the pawn. So with this move, white has to let the king out of the corner. He doesn't have time. He doesn't have time to bring in his king. Black's king can just move back and forth wherever white goes, as long as he goes into the corner when white tries this idea. Remember that in the stair-stepping method, white gets to this basic position where he both gives check and is on the pawn and forces black's king in front of the pawn. And with a bishop pawn, when black can get his king to the corner, then black can get a draw. So this position is a draw. And the next case with the rook pawn, when black's king is near to the corner, or white's king is far away, then black can get a draw. Once again, if white tries this basic pattern, which is the way that we'd seen before when white can win, white has to get to this position where black's king has to go in front of the pawn. With a rook pawn, when black's king moves into the corner, then he's stalemated, so white can't move his king forward because it's stalemate, and white has to let black's king out of the corner. Can't really make progress. Black doesn't move in front of the pawn here, so that white doesn't have time to bring in his king. White brings in his king, then black will just queen the pawn. And for white to win in the basic position, has to get to this basic position. The exception with the rook pawn, as we've seen, is that black has this resource of just moving into the corner where he's stalemated, so white doesn't have time to bring in his king, and white has to let black's king out. He can't stay on the G file because it would be stalemate. So he has to let black's king out one way or the other. And now he has to stop the pawn from queening, and once again, this basic idea, which ordinarily wins, fails in the case of a rook pawn because of the stalemate idea. There is, however, a special case with the rook pawn where white can win. And we've already looked at the four most important patterns to know that if white can get his queen in front of the pawn, then white can win. In the ordinary cases, other than the two special cases that we'd already seen of the rook pawn and bishop pawn, white has a winning method where he can just move in his queen diagonally and reach the key position that we'd seen before, where his queen gives check and is on the pawn, forcing black's king in front of the pawn, and then white can bring in his king. Here, if white's king were far away, then black would have a draw with the same pattern that we've seen before. But there's a case where white can get a win by moving his king in front of the queen, allowing black's king out of the corner. So here the winning move, and the only winning move, is to go in front of the queen, and now black's king can get out. And now white can move his king in closer and give check. Black's best is to go here. Note that if he goes into the corner, once again, white moves his king forward, moves his king in, and blocks the b file again. And now his king can get on the pawn. And now, if black's king moves away, then white will just take the pawn with king takes pawn. And if he goes into the corner, then it's mate in one. So black can last a little bit longer with this idea. And now white uses the idea of giving check. Black moves here to support the pawn. Note that if black moves back, white can just take the diagonal, leading to the queening square. And using the fact that if he can get his queen in front of the pawn, then it's an easy win. So black can't queen the pawn because white would just take it. And anywhere else that black goes, white will just move his queen in front of the pawn, and and black can never queen the pawn, and white can just approach with his king. Actually, here black needs to hang on to the pawn, and white can just block. Can block these squares, forcing black's king away and then just taking the pawn. It's one winning method. So black's best is to go here, and now it's not always so easy to remember these special cases and patterns, but if you remember the general rule, then the main challenge is to find the winning idea where white will allow black to promote his pawn because his king will be close enough to give mate, or in this case, with this idea, now if black promotes his pawn, white can get to this key position. Note this key position with a rook pawn. Black's king is to come in to support the pawn, and white's queen cuts off the king, and white's queen cuts off the black king, and the king controls these squares in front of the pawn. Are these squares. The main point is this is a win. Black doesn't have any moves that give check to where he can just check the king around and get a draw. He can't move his king because of the mate threat, and he can't go into the corner. He just doesn't have any moves that give check. And then if he moves his queen out, he can't cover these key squares, and white will just give mate. Let's take a look at that again and see that black just doesn't have a move with his queen that'll cover the mating squares, and also the mate's on the back rank. We should note that white's in the position to give mate with all of these moves. If black's queen doesn't cover any of these squares, black's queen can't give check. There isn't any stalemate resource, and wherever he goes, you can't stop there are just too many mates. So once again, in this key position, this very strong idea, using the fact that if white can get to the position with this king there on b3, then white can reach this winning position. White allows black to promote his pawn and can give mate on the next move. So once again, we'll see the special case. White can move his king in front of the queen, allowing black's king out, moves it in closer again by giving check, and then brings in his queen, and then brings in his king with this idea that we just seen. And remember, the most important things to know are the four main ideas that we've looked at before. If white can move his queen in front of the pawn, he can win, can always win. In the general idea, where white has the winning method of stair stepping, bringing his queen in one square diagonally at a time, always either giving check or pinning the pawn until he can force black's king in front of the pawn and then bring in his king. And then the other two things are the rook pawn and the bishop pawn, where black can use the stalemate idea to get a draw. And we're just looking at the exceptions to those rules, these special cases. So here's another special case with the rook pawn, and that is when white's king is close enough to give mate after promoting the pawn. But before we look at that, let's come back to this position. And here, white's king can be on, there's a zone. If white's king is within that zone, then he can get a win. And this is just a special pattern that you could memorize. But again, it's really a special case. Practically, it might not come up that much. But I do want to show the idea of the zone. These first two ranks cover these 3 squares, the next two, these 4 squares, and then finally these 5 squares on the 3 ranks. So that if white's king is on any of these squares, he can get a draw with the special case of moving in front of the queen. And the other case is when white's king will be close enough to where he can allow black to promote the pawn and then give mate. So here, white's king is in the zone and white can win as follows. Stair stepping in front. And as before, if black's king moves back, then white can get on this diagonal. And black can't prevent white from getting in front of the pawn with an easy win. So black has to move forward to support his pawn. And now, again, there's a strong X-clam type move where white can win by getting close enough with his king. This works because white's king supports this key square, and the idea is that it'll allow black to queen the pawn because he has mate on the next move. And black's other try is to under-promote to a knight to prevent the immediate mate. But with queen versus knight, it's a very straightforward win. White just moves in his king, and he'll give mate on the next move. Of course, if black moves his king, there's mate on the back rank. And if he moves his knight, then there's mate on b2. Unless, of course, he goes finally to this square, and that just allows another mate in 2. Now, I had mentioned the 4 key positions, and actually this position is a good one to remember. You don't have to remember like a special zone or all these special cases. This is the position where white can win even though black has a bishop pawn if black's king is too far away from the corner where he could go to get a stalemate. And white can win by preventing black's king from getting to the queen side. So in this position, white can pin the pawn and cut off the squares. Of course, if black goes in front of the pawn, then white brings in his king with that same winning method that we'd seen before. So in this position, queen b3, pinning the pawn to cut off black's king from the queen side. Black goes up, and now white pins the pawn again and completely cuts off black's king from the queen side. Black's only move that is to go here to d1. Any other move, and white will just take the pawn. And now, once again, white can use the same pattern of supporting the e2 square. In this case, he moves his king forward, covering this square, and now allowing black to promote the pawn because white has mate on the next move. And if black under promotes, once again, white can win pretty straightforwardly. Here black is in zugzwang, and any move that he makes, white will mate very quickly. And if black moves his king up, then white can go here with the pawn pinned. Black's only move is to go here. If he steps back, once again, white can get his queen in front of the pawn with an easy win. So black goes to the back rank, and then white forces black's king in front of the pawn. And now the key idea is not to bring in the king, because this will allow black to move toward the corner, making this move with the threat of promoting the pawn. And as we'd seen before, black has this resource. White must not allow black's king into the corner, or he can use the stalemate idea. Instead, when black's king goes in front of the pawn, white plays this move with the winning idea of cutting off black's king, preventing him from getting into the corner. And here, actually, there's a forced mate. So this position is actually a fifth key position to remember, without having to memorize things such as special zones. Just to know that a bishop pawn, black can get a draw if his king can get to the corner with the stalemate idea. When the king's further away from the corner, white wins by cutting the king off from the queen side. And there's one more case with the bishop pawn on the 7th rank supported by black's king. There is one more case where white can win this position, and this is a special case. Even though black's king can go into the corner, if white's king is close enough, then he can allow the pawn to promote and give mate on the next move. Let's see how this works. White gives check along the diagonal. Black moves away. If black goes to b1, then white can move in his king with the same winning idea. If black promotes his pawn, now white has this idea. Black's king must go into the corner, and now white's queen will get in on this mating square. So with black's king on this square and the pawn promoting here, the mating square is going to be here on a2, where black's king cannot move away because of the queen on c1. So we'll see this pattern. White moves in his king. Black promotes, and now this square is blocked. And if white can get his queen to this square, it'll be mate. So he can force black's king into the corner by giving check, again moving with check, and then coming in to give mate. So black's best is to go here, and now white pins the pawn and attacks it directly. Black comes in to support the pawn, cutting off the king, pinning the pawn, and getting on the queening square. We're looking at this position. Now black moves forward, supporting the pawn with the threat of just queening the pawn. But white again can ignore this threat with this key idea, and with the threat of queen takes pawn and then queen a2 mate. Of course, if black moves his king, then this is mate. Then this is mate. If black promotes his pawn, then it's mate in one. So going back here, king b3, the winning idea. If black promotes his pawn to a queen or a rook, then white has mate in one. Once again, the queen is blocking black's flight square. And again, if black under promotes to a knight to cover this mate, then white can simply go here, and he's going to give mate on his next move. Wherever black goes, if he moves his king into the corner, it's mate, and if he moves his knight, I suppose this is the only move that would cover that mate, but then white just takes the knight with an easy win. Here's another case. We're going to look at the same pattern. White's king is close enough to the pawn to get a win as before. White moves in his queen, pinning the pawn. Black wants to avoid stepping in front. White's queen is placed to cut the king off from the corner, and can just go here and reach this key pattern. He doesn't need to block black's king away from the corner, because white's king is close enough to come in. And we see this pattern once again, this key position against a bishop pawn, where white's king is close enough to reach this pattern that we had seen on the previous game. And there's one more special case, and again, these are special cases. The really important ones to memorize are the ones that I've gone over before. If the queen can get in front of the pawn, then the side with the queen will win. There's the basic stair-stepping pattern that we've looked at. The two main patterns with the rook pawn and the bishop pawn, where black's king can go into the corner because of the stalemate idea. And then the case of a bishop pawn where white can cut off black's king from the corner. And then we're looking at these special cases where white's king happens to be close enough. And in this case, white's king is, the idea is not that he'll allow the pawn to promote and give mate. The idea is that white's king is close enough to be able to cut off the queening square. So let's take a look. White pins the pawn, and black moves up his king. If black goes into the corner, the main idea we'll see is that white can cover the queening square with his king. Of course, if white captures the pawn, then it's a stalemate. But white's king is just close enough to cover the queening square. And white's queen and king are both on the pawn. And of course, if black promotes the pawn, white can just capture it because there's no stalemate. And if black goes in front of the pawn, white just cuts him off from the queening square, and we get this same mating pattern. Black has to go here, and the pawn blocks the flight square. And actually, in this case, the mate is inevitable. Black's king is forced here, and then white's king is close enough to support mate. So after white pins the pawn, black's best is to go here, and now white gives check. And once again, if black comes into the corner, then white's king can cover the queening square, and white did not allow stalemate. And the final thing to remember, and this again is one of the key positions, but it just builds on the idea of the first concept that if white can get his queen in front of the pawn, then he can always win. There's no stalemate, and black can never promote the pawn. So black, when his pawn is not on the 7th rank, when it's not yet on the 7th rank, then white can win in a very straightforward way. There's just one special case, a very special case that's an exception to this rule, but in all the other cases, if black's pawn is not yet on the 7th rank, then white can always win. Here, with black to move, he can't move his pawn to the 7th rank, so he moves his king to the side to support the pawn, cover the queening square. And here the winning method is white just brings in his queen. Black's king is forced in front of the pawn, and then now white can bring in his king. And now white could win, as we've seen in the first main example, by giving check, pinning the pawn, and eventually reaching the position, the key position that we'd seen before. But here with the pawn on the 6th rank, white can actually win just by bringing in his king. The point is that if black moves to promote his pawn, white's queen can get in front of the pawn. No matter where black goes, white will just move in front of the pawn with an easy win. In the case of a rook pawn, the win is even easier. When black's pawn is not yet on the 7th rank, white will win. Here he can give check. Black's king moves forward to support the pawn. Check once more. And now black's king must move here, or white will just take the pawn. And now black's king is not stalemated. Note that if this were the same position but just shifted back one rank, if black's king were in the corner with the queen on the g file and the pawn blocking the square, then it would be stalemate. One move back, white can just play a waiting move and he'll win the pawn on his next turn. And this is more out of sort of problem-like interest. It's not one of these practical positions. It's good to know, but just another sort of interesting special case. This particular position is actually a draw with white to move because of the terrible placement of white's king, where white's king will block white's queen from giving enough checks. White can't prevent black from getting his pawn to the 7th rank when black will get a draw. So with this check, and black wants to support his pawn and doesn't want to get in front of it, giving white time to move in his king. And here with the unfortunate placement of white's king blocks this long diagonal. If white's king were somewhere else, then white could move here, pinning the pawn and getting enough time to move in and win. So white can give another check, and now black will just repeat the position, and once again white's king is blocking off that long diagonal and repeating the position. And if white's queen gives check along the 2nd rank, then black can get his pawn to the 7th rank, and he can use the stalemate idea to get a draw. So again, that's one of the special cases, and let's just go back and take a quick look at the most practical things to know, once again, to review. So if white can get his queen in front of the pawn, then it's an easy win for white. Without the special cases of stalemate, White just stair steps his queen forward, giving check with each move, and attacking the pawn and covering the queening square. And now when black makes his only move that doesn't lose the pawn, we get to this key position. This important concept to note: the winning method is to get the queen where it's both attacking the pawn and giving check. Black doesn't have time to do anything, but the only move that he can make is to move his king in front of the pawn. So we force the king in front of the pawn, and that gives us enough time to move in our king. And we repeat to get to the same pattern and move in the king. Once again, reaching this key position with time to move in the king. And now white can, his king is close enough to give mate. A special case. And now the next key concept: bishop pawn, when black's king can get into the corner and black can get a draw by stalemate. White's king is too far away to reach any of the special cases that we'd seen before, where white's king either can cover the queening square or allow black to promote, because white can get a win, checkmate. And the special case of the rook pawn, where again black can get a draw by using that stalemate idea. And then the final thing to know, if black's pawn is not yet on the 7th rank, then white can win every time. King in front of the pawn gives white time to move up his king. And now white's queen cuts off black's king, and he'll be able to get in front of the pawn and win easily. This has been a lesson, chess endgame lesson by Chris Cohen, and thanks for your time.